Okay, well now today we are in the 5th chapter of John. John chapter 5. And this particular instance is what I'm going to call Jesus Offers New Life. And this would be Roman numeral 1, the third sign. And we're going to look first of all at the setting. The setting of the third sign. Well, this is the third sign in a series of signs that Jesus did, not only to prove that he was God, but also to show the people that they had an alternative. They had something that they could do. Well, let me go back here and let me go back on that a little bit. Not something that they could do, but something that he could do for them. Now, Jesus was not just a good teacher. Jesus was a good teacher, but he was not just a good teacher. He was not just a good man. He was not just a good example. He was not just a rabbi, although he was. No, Jesus had something else that they needed. We talked briefly in the previous video about a woman. Well, now we're going to look at a man this time. To be fair, we should look at a man this time. Well, we're going to look at some of the who, what, where, how, and why of this third sign. First of all, the setting was a feast. There are many different feasts in the Bible that it talks about. So now we're going to go to John chapter 5 and verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was on a hill. This is where Abraham had nearly sacrificed his own son. And it was also the place where David was promised that there would be a temple someday. And then David's son, Solomon, David enabled his son through God's grace to build a temple there in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was well established then at this time. This would have been the first century. So there was a feast. Well, there were several feasts in the Old Testament times. We have to remember that Jesus lived in Old Testament times. I don't know if you realize that or if you knew that, but Jesus did. He lived in Old Testament times. And also, as we're going to see from this verse that I'm going to talk about here, that Jesus not only lived in Old Testament times, but he was the reason for the New Testament. Now this is what the Bible says. For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. Now, here is legal language like lawyers like to use. This is from Hebrews 9, 16, and 17. Here's what verse 17 says. For a testament is of force after men are dead. Otherwise it is of no strength at all, while the testator liveth. Who was the testator? What does that mean? Well, the testator was Jesus himself. And the testament was a promise. It was a contract I studied business law a little bit in high school. I thought I'd just try it, studied business law. Well, I learned that a contract is binding. A contract usually is signed by both parties. In this case, a testament is a will, and a will does not take effect until someone dies. The contract, therefore, is only in effect when someone dies. Well, Jesus was the one who died, and so, yes, he did die at the hands of the Roman government and at the hands of the Jewish people, but he arose again. But that time where Jesus died, that was when the new covenant or the new testament began. Jesus was at this feast because he was an obedient Jew who believed the Old Testament laws, and the law stated that a person that was 12 years old or younger had to be at this feast. Well, since Jesus lived in Old Testament times, this could have been the Feast of Tabernacles, or of Passover, or of Purim, or the Feast of Pentecost. Several different feasts are mentioned in the Bible. There is in Jerusalem an archaeological dig where a pool was found. Let's look at this second verse of chapter 5 in John. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. Well, they have found where this pool was, and if you see a picture of it, you can see the 5 porches, otherwise known as 5 roofed colonnades. And these areas, these 5 porches, is where the people that were sick and with diseases and missing limbs and so forth, this is where they would go. Because this pool, the Pool of Bethesda, was said to have healing properties. These were good Jews, and so they believed that God could heal. Well, at this archaeological dig, they found on this church, the Church of St. Anne, they found there a mural of some kind, a painting that depicted people being baptized or people coming to this pool of water, and so they figured out that this was this Pool of Bethesda. Now there are in Jerusalem several different sources of water, and this was just one of them. The Pool of Bethesda, let's talk about that. There were several other sources of water in Jerusalem. They had to have water, of course. I've seen pictures of this pool, and it really does have these 5 porches or 5 colonnades with roofs. Archaeologists have found this pool north of Jerusalem. Well, this man, he was crippled or disabled in some way for 38 years, it says. Well, let's look at verse 5 now. Why don't I read verses 3 through 5. In these lay a multitude of individuals, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. So this man was an invalid. He was disabled in some way. It doesn't really tell us his medical condition because the Bible isn't made to describe medical conditions. The Bible is there to help people to come to the Lord. Well, there were other disabled people there. There it says in verse 3, blind, lame, paralyzed. So they had any kind of disease or disablement. Well, this man didn't know Jesus, and Jesus asked the man, do you want to be healed? Now I think that's quite a question to ask someone, do you want to be healed? Because Jesus wanted this man to see his condition. He already knew his condition, but Jesus wanted him to also see that there was hope. What is it that is bothering you? Is it someone or some burden? Or is it some problem? Well, this is a good question. Do you want help? Do you want to be healed? This was a good question Jesus asked this man, do you want to be healed? There's no doubt the man wanted to be healed. No doubt he was a normal human being. He didn't know that the great physician was the one that was asking this question, do you want to be healed? Some beggars are afraid to be healed because they're afraid of losing their income. Maybe he was afraid of that. Maybe he was afraid of losing some of his old friends. Maybe he had just given up. Well, we should have compassion on all people. If you're a believer, you should have compassion on all people. Some people are afraid to have any kind of change. They're afraid to change jobs, or they're afraid to stay with a husband or a wife, or they're afraid to ask God to heal them. We're all afraid of something. Some of us are afraid to take the next step that we know is right. Well, this man believed the water could heal him, and that the pool had healing properties. Let's look at verse 7 again. The sick man answered him, Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me. So that's verse 7. You see, he had a false belief that when the water was stirred up, that would heal him. Many people today have superstitions. This man had one. This man believed the water could heal him, that the pool had healing properties. People have superstitions just like this man. And they put their faith in those things instead of putting their faith in Jesus Christ himself. This man thought he wasn't healed because someone beat him to it. You know, he said, someone gets there before me, they don't help me in, it's their fault. Well, maybe he was dirty, maybe he was smelly, maybe no one wanted to touch him, maybe no one had compassion on him. But you know, there was one person there that did. I don't know why Jesus picked this man out instead of some of the other people, but he did. But how would you feel if you were disabled and no one would touch you? Well, we're going to look at this man and this problem that he had and how Jesus would help him when we look at this issue again.